Good evening to those who are in our time zone. We are currently in Israel. And good morning to those on the other side of the globe. Good afternoon if you are in some other place. And welcome to Rope's webinar series, over 100 days of war in Gaza. What's next? Thank you very much for joining this Zoom event. My name is Ksenia Svetlova. I'm a journalist, a former member of Knesset, and since 2023, I have an honor to lead Ropes as an executive director. Some of you are joining us for the very first time, so just a few words about us. Ropes stands for Regional Organization for Peace, Economics and Security. We run several types of programs. We hold summits for Israeli, Palestinian, and regional emerging leaders, most recently in Tbilisi, Georgia, this past July. We bring delegations of emerging leaders from across the Middle East and North Africa to visit Israel and the West Bank. We have an education exchange program for Israeli, Palestinian, regional students. And thanks to our new grant from the US Embassy in Israel, we will soon have a new program specifically for female regional journalists, again, Israelis, Palestinians, and regionals. The alumni of our programs include current and former members of parliament, diplomats, entrepreneurs, journalists, venture capitalists, cultural figures, and other young change makers from Israel, Palestinian territories, and 10 Arab countries in the Middle East. We believe in regional integration. We believe in the post-conflict Middle East, and we believe also that the best way to do it is speak to one another. So this is the point of these webinars as well. We want to discuss current events. We want to stress the importance of regional cooperation, and we want to bring the unique voices in order to talk about the challenges, the difficulties, but also the benefits of regional cooperation. So today we have with us three amazing panelists. They will have a chance also for an introduction to talk about the current situation in Gaza and what they make out of it. And then we will go to the Q&A. And I encourage each and every one of you to write questions, to send them to our Q&A box. We will make sure to answer as many as our time frame allows. This webinar will last for 60 minutes, unless we will see that we are swamped with your questions, and then we can try to extend it for a few minutes longer, but not much longer, because our panelists are very busy people. So I would like to, first of all, introduce this distinguished panel, a group of people who I'm proudly call them friends and the people with whom we share common values. Dalia Shendlin is a political scientist and a public opinion expert. She has advised 9 national campaigns in Israel and has worked in 15 other countries with regional expertise in the Balkans and Eastern Europe, post-conflict societies and transitional democracies. Dalia conducts research and policy analysis on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, democracy, human rights, and politics. She holds a PhD in political science from Tel Aviv University. She's also a fellow at Century International, a columnist at Haaretz, and a frequent commentator for global media, including CNN and BBC. Her book, The Crooked Timber of Democracy in Israel, was published in September 2023, and it is highly recommended. Ahmad Fouad al-Khatib is an American Palestinian Middle East political analyst. He was born in Gaza, and he still has a family there. He has a master's degree in intelligence studies from American Military University and has written and contributed extensively to publications on Gaza's affairs in US, Israeli, Jewish, and Arab outlets. He is the founder and executive director of Project Unified Assistance, a nonprofit organization working towards the establishment of a humanitarian airport in the Gaza Strip to be run and operated by the United Nations. And last but not the least, David Makovsky is a Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute and the director of the Koret Project on Arab-Israeli relations. He is also an adjunct professor in Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins University, Paul H. Nitz School of Advanced International Studies. In 2013 to 2014, he worked in the office of the US Secretary of State, serving as a senior advisor to the Special Envoy for Palestinian-Israeli negotiations. He is a co-author with Dennis Ross of the 2019 book, Be Strong and of Good Courage, how Israel's most important leaders shaped its destiny, and the 2009 Washington Post bestseller, Myths, Illusions, and Peace, Finding a New Direction for America in the Middle East. Also, David and Dalia are distinguished members of ROPE's advisory board. I strongly recommend to follow all three on Twitter, and we will be publishing right now in the chat box the Twitter handles, all of our three panelists. But basically, you can just write their name in the Twitter and follow all of them, the three of them. It's a fascinating reading and a lot of exclusive materials about what is actually happening in Israel, in Gaza, in the West Bank, and in the US policy in the Middle East. So as I told you, we will begin with an introduction by our three panelists. I will pose a question to the three of you about the current situation in Israel, respectively, Dalia, and Gaza for you, Ahmed, and the American policy in the Middle East for you, David. And you have 5, 6, 7 minutes in order to discuss how the war in Gaza, the massacre of the 10/7, the war in Gaza, had affected also the political situation, but also the state of minds of the people who live in these areas, the decision makers, and of course, the perspective for any future settlement between Israel and the Palestinians with the help of the Middle Eastern region. Ladies first, so Dalia, the mic is yours, please.
Thank you, Ksenia, for the kind introduction. It's nice to thank you for everybody for attending, and thank you to my co-panelists also for being here. It would be impossible to summarize in 5 to 7 minutes the impacts of what's happened on Israeli society, but let me try to break it down into a few categories. I'll briefly try to touch on society, politics, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So in terms of the impact on Israeli society, it's been very severe. Of course, what happened on October 7th, the main point to make is that it was not only on October 7th, but what happened that day, of course, affected thousands and thousands of people, the people who were killed, the people who were kidnapped. And it's important to remember that all of their circles, their families, their contacts, their friends have been deeply traumatized as well. Beyond that, we have up to 200,000, maybe it's down to somewhere over 100,000 people who have been displaced from either the south or the north during that time. We have people who, it seems like everybody in the country knows somebody who is serving in the army, who is either in danger or has been killed or wounded. And that number in total, of course, goes up to thousands and thousands of people. And of course, much of the country was living under rocket fire, very intensive rocket fire for the first a couple of months of this, which has somewhat died down in the center, but still occasionally ongoing in other parts of the country, in the south in particular, and the north. And the impact as a whole is enormous. I think there is a general sense of collective trauma. It may not be quite as urgent seeming as it was in the first few months, especially I think the fact that rocket fire has died down in recent weeks is a turning point, but the trauma will go on for generations, for certainly for years. And again, because it's ongoing, there are still people in danger, soldiers dying, people displaced, and more information coming out about October 7th. So this is a very, the major impact has been on Israelis becoming very hard line in their attitudes in many ways, and we'll talk about it in a minute. I also want to point out that there's the physical disruption, people dislocated, people unable to go to school, certainly in the first month and a half, and economic, major economic impact of everything. People have lost their businesses because they're in reserves. The Israeli economy is suffering in general from things like lack of tourism. All these generate, widespread uncertainty for Israeli society. In terms of politics, it has had a deep influence on Israelis feeling more negative about the government. I don't have time to go through all the indicators, but trust me, all of them are bad for the government. And that is confirmed by dozens of polls that have come out. For the most part, people blame the government, blame the prime minister, blame his party. And they also, to some extent, blame the army and the security services, but really the political level is taking most of the blame. That is a little, but I would say one point on that, it's a little bit preliminary to assume that all of those negative polls would definitely lead to a political transition in the next election, mostly because we don't know when that next election will be and what might happen up until then. And the last thing I'll talk about, I know I'm rushing through these, but I'm trying to keep within the 5 minutes, is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There is absolutely no question that the pattern for Israelis certainly over the last 25 years has been that when there is an escalation on the Israeli-Palestinian front in ways that harm Israeli civilians particularly, that Israelis become more hardline in their attitudes. They become less supportive of conciliatory attitudes, less supportive of concessions, less supportive of a two-state solution, and are more likely to vote for parties that do not support those things or that actively oppose them. That is what we've seen in the past. And so far, the form that's taking is widespread support for everything to do with the war. This is what we see in survey research. So just to set the kind of stage for you as to where Israelis are now, they are feeling very belligerent. They feel like this is an existential war of survival, and they pretty much support what is happening in the war, even if, like a bit of a mirror image on the Palestinian side, they're kind of, in a way, declining to actually look at the humanitarian devastation and the loss of Palestinian lives on the other side. So that is, I think, the first major impact. What we've seen is, drop in support for the two-state solution to about just around 1/4 of the Jewish population. And when you add the higher number of Arab or Palestinian citizens of Israel who support the two-state solution, overall, you only have about 1/3 of Israelis who support it right now. Also a mirror image with public opinion on the Palestinian side. The last thing I will say, because it seems to me I've used up my time, is that the connection between people's attitudes becoming more hardline right now is likely to lead to them self-identifying more with the right wing over the coming phase. I'm already seeing small indications of that in survey research, but it does not necessarily mean good news for Netanyahu, because people are at the same time very angry at him and blaming him by and large for everything that has gone wrong. And it's not yet clear whether this will lead to significantly growing support for the far extremist right-wing parties that were in the original coalition. They are seeing a slight rise in recent weeks, but we don't exactly know yet. And so far, the biggest winner from the changing polling dynamics, given everything I said about people being angry at the government, but also right-wing and kind of hardline, has translated into support for the party of Benny Gantz, National Unity Party, which is what Israelis view as a center-right leaning party, essentially tough, strong on security, but and generally not a party that is associated with concessions or peace, but certainly pragmatic and a secular party in its general orientation. And that party has been doing the best in all polls since October 7th. But again, there's a long way to go to find out what this will actually mean when it comes to elections, because they're far off. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dalia, just in time. We have definitely a lot of questions for you that are already pouring in about the polls and about many other issues that you mentioned, but we will have to wait for those for the Q&A part. I would like to go now to you, Ahmed. I was asked in the very few days of the war after 10/7 by friends who live abroad, and they asked me, so how are you? How are you coping? And there was this very famous, we are not okay, so we are not okay. So I personally know that you are not okay. And I would like to offer the condolences on behalf of the ropes organizations, because we know that you lost many family members in the recent war in Gaza. So this is first, and I would like to definitely ask you about what is going on the ground in the Gaza Strip. We have very little information about what is actually happening. There are no journalists. The journalists who are there, and you maybe can expand about it, they have to work with Hamas, so it will be allowed for them to be there. And you bring very unique voice from inside of what is happening right now. The demos, the protests, the perhaps support of the Hamas. Please enlighten us. What is going on in Gaza?
Thank you so much. Thanks for the opportunity. And yeah, I mean, I wanted to start by saying any they trained us that any good analyst should always acknowledge their own biases, and my own bias is the fact that I have skin in the game, which both bolsters my perspective, but makes me a little bit partial in that I have family in there, but most of my immediate and extended, and I have in fact unfortunately lost over 30 of them, including young ones as little as 3 and 4 months old. My family's from Gaza City in the north, but as the war progressed, they kept migrating southwards, and they just now made it out of Khan Yunis, and are now in Rafah in the south. So, and I have a series of contacts and family and professionals that I am in close contact with on a regular basis, precisely because I also experience that information blackout, and Al Jazeera Arabic is not going to show us anything meaningful. And so the main challenge right now is that you have the majority of Gaza's population concentrated in the south, in Rafah. And my brother and his family and his colleagues are literally sleeping in a coffee shop that basically is now doubling up as a shelter. Any and every inch of available space in southern Gaza is not, mainly in Rafah, has now been turned into living quarters, a refuge, a staging area for humanitarian operations, or just kind of a staging area for receiving those who are fleeing Khan Yunis. My aunt and two cousins are unfortunately surrounded in the Amal Hospital in Khan Yunis. There are two main hospitals in there. What has made this incredibly challenging just over the last 3 days is that the Mawasi area, which is the former grounds for the Gush Katif complex, was declared as a safe space by the IDF and the spokesperson. And you have all these makeshift tents and caravans and places that are housing people. Unfortunately, part of the assault, the ground assault by IDF troops, is coming from the western axis, if you will, such that this is, harming a lot of the people that are the tens of thousands that are in the formerly designated safe zone. And so, I was motivated before. I work in international development. I have a day job. I work, mainly in Africa with global health and poverty alleviation. And on October 7th, I absolutely experienced horror from an entirely different angle, not just because I genuinely think that what took place was incredibly grotesque and horrendous, but because I knew I had, been privy to a series of kind of events and information leading up to October 7th. I knew what I believed was the real motivation for Hamas to launch the horrendous attack. But before getting into that, and perhaps we can discuss this more later on, I knew that Gaza as we knew it would cease to exist, and that this was a disastrous event of epic proportions, and that this would directly impact my family and the people in Gaza. And I was also equally horrified by the scenes of celebrations and jubilance, but I also have a broader context that not only let me know why people are brainwashed into believing Hamas's propaganda, but also showed me that many people that weren't celebrating and that were horrified and that knew that this was a disaster and that Hamas was hiding its failures behind this effort, and that Hamas being part of this axis of resistance is a disaster for the people of Gaza. Over the months since the war, and that's been really difficult to capture, particularly with these polls, which I am vehemently frustrated with, because there is this Western obsession, and I don't say Western to be, hipster. Like I consider myself a Westerner. I'm a proud American. I love the West, but there is nevertheless this like obsession with trying to capture sentiments in Gaza and in the Palestinian territories, but specifically I'm talking in Gaza through these polls. And if you think about a Gaza context, and I have a Wall Street Journal piece coming out in a couple of days, and I've written about this before, but like, a lot of people are just not going to participate honestly and openly in these polls, because they're going to think you're either face-to-face interactions. They're going to think you're either a Hamas informant or you're an Israeli collaborator. furthermore, think of all the, the Hamas enthusiasts that are cyber warriors, that are, thugs that mount these. When Gazans protested against Hamas, Hamas would unleash its own thugs and its own warriors and its own counter protests and demonstrators. I have it from firsthand info that Hamas encourages its people to participate in any and every one of these polls, which fail to reach people in crowded refugee camps, tend to target people who are from a particular social class, even though the conductors of these surveys would deny that. And most importantly, you have people, you have less than a few hundred people that participated in these sample sizes. And my point and intention isn't to manufacture dissent where none exists. My point is that there's a massive swell of anti-Hamas, anti-violence, anti-armed resistance sentiment in Gaza that is incredibly uncaptured and incredibly suppressed. It's difficult to capture. People don't have internet. People can't express it. There are no journalists operating. I have it on good authority that the couple of journalists, I mean couple metaphorically to demonstrate how few journalists there are, that Hamas went to these people and regularly tells them you cannot air anti-Hamas sentiments lest you be accused of being a traitor and a coward. Look at me and the ferocious attacks that I get on a daily basis for speaking out against Hamas. Who would have thought that being anti-Hamas, an anti-overt terror group that has hindered Palestinian progress and damaged Palestinian lives would be so controversial? So if I'm facing this as a privileged Westerner in the United States, imagine how difficult it is for people on the ground in Gaza to say this. So that's what frustrates me, is that there is this, I see this shift, and I'm talking about Gaza. We'll get to the West Bank in a second, and yes, the swelling of Hamas popularity, that is absolutely true. And I've written about this in The Atlantic. I've written about this also in other outlets. But in Gaza, at a time when so many people on the ground are turning against Hamas, you have these morons, unfortunately, who hide behind the pro-Palestine banner that are becoming overt. Like before it was like, well, I don't support Hamas, but blah, 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 blah. Now it's like, oh, actually, like maybe Hamas is a resistance organization. Maybe Hamas is, so that's been incredibly frustrating. People in Gaza are tired. They are desperate for a ceasefire. I have documented and shared dozens of anecdotal evidence, samples, including people, calling for godly vengeance on those who have caused this issue. People saying that Hamas steals the aid. People being frustrated by Hamas's unwillingness to release the hostages. In the last couple of days, we've seen small, you can call them protests, that are demanding a ceasefire and an end to the war. And we have to also keep in mind that sometimes with a lot of these messages and videos that are coming out of Gaza, you're not going to get somebody to be like, I am specifically against Hamas, blah, blah, blah. People will use like veiled attempts to try to like camouflage this so that Hamas isn't so, to reduce the risk of immediate and explicit backlash. So again, people will say things like, Hasbi Allah wa ni'mal wakil, calling for godly vengeance on those who brought this upon them. I can guarantee you that the hundreds of thousands of people who are displaced, those who are standing in lines for hours to use a dirty, disgusting public bathroom, sharing a toilet with 700 people, those who are struggling to find food, and we're talking about the inevitability of famine, and that's not just hysteria. The statistics back that up, and that's why I've been spearheading a campaign to airdrop food onto Gaza. We're talking about people who are in miserable conditions, and I promise you, they're not going to be in line standing there and thinking, gee, like, wow, Hamas's military marvelous success on October 7th was really helpful for the people. And again, finally, I'll conclude with this. There are tiers to the opposition of Hamas. It's kind of, think of it as an onion with a core. Hamas will always have ideological supporters and people who believe it's violence, people who, like, that's never going to change. But then there are patrons and affiliates of Hamas who have professionally benefited from the group being there, but like they're not ideological members. And then there's just like casual people that are, call them ignorant, call them underinformed, whatever, that support Hamas. Then there are people who are like, okay, well, I just want a job and Hamas is the only government in town, so that's how I can have a job. So like, and then there's like people that are like, well, I hate Hamas, I can't stand them, but like, what am I going to do? I'm not going to risk my life. So there are tiers of Hamas support, just as there are tiers for Hamas opposition. There are people that are like, I hate Hamas because I can't have a job. There are people who are opposed Hamas because they think it's genuinely an immoral and a disgusting group that uses Islamism and has aligned the Palestinian cause with the worst regional players. I mean, the Houthis, the slave-owning Houthis, and Iran, and the Shia militias, the criminal Shia militias in Iraq and Lebanon. And then there are people that are like, Fatah members and pro-Palestinian Authority, and those number in the hundreds of thousands, and those have always vehemently opposed Hamas. And then there are people that maybe are only opposing Hamas as a result of the continuous disasters. They might have been, like apolitical, but just are living the consequences of Hamas. So I'll stop there. I'm sorry for going over time, but I'm happy to answer questions later on.
Ahmed, thank you so very much. And I will just remind to everybody who is watching us that there were 2 protests against the Hamas just in the last 24 hours, both of them in Khan Yunis, with outstanding amount of support and with banners that said, also, we want to go back home to our home in northern Gaza, not river from the sea. And also let's release the hostages, which is also very, very important. Also very important to the Israeli public opinion. So we'll definitely have more questions for you, Ahmed. So this is coming. And now I would like to turn to you, David, with the question of $1 million. Who calls the shots? We see that, there are many leaks, many reports that US is frustrated with the Israeli government and it tries to negotiate a deal, and it's already actually drawing the day after without the Israeli government. So who calls the shots, and what actually you make out of the American policy right now towards Gaza, Israel, Palestinian Authority, and the Middle East in general?
Okay. Thank you very much, Ksenia. And it's an honor to be with Dalia and Ahmed. I also want to just give a shout out to Ben Birnbaum. I remember when he approached me with the idea of ropes several years before the Abraham Accords, and he had the vision to see it through. He said, "Hey, will you be on my advisory board?" I said, like, how could I say no? And it's really how he's built it up, and you, Ksenia, very involved with it, and it's just, I think it's a great organization. I think someone would say, well, once there's an Abraham Accords, is there a need? And I would say, no, it's even more of a need, because you have to translate a lot of these kind of, government to government peace into a peace between peoples, because the peace between governments that we saw with Egypt and Israel, Jordan and Israel, never really morphed into a peace between peoples. I think this has a chance now, and these sorts of grassroots efforts that you guys are doing, I think is terrific. So I salute you, Ksenia and Ben, and for your vision and making this possible. So with that, I'll just say, where's the United States in all this? I think it's kind of clear that, President had like 3 objectives right after October 7th. One was to, fly to Israel, identify with Israel's pain in a way that, I think that there's kind of certain magical moments in the history of U.S.-Israel relations of 75 years that I could think of, where a president coming, identifying with Israel during a crisis is never forgotten. I remember Bill Clinton, when there were 4 bombs in 9 days, and he came to Israel. Yes, they had a Sharm el-Sheikh conference, which I think was forgettable, but he went to an Israeli high school and talked about the future. I remember, this isn't an American moment, but I remember King Hussein, right after a gunman, a deranged gunman of Jordan, killed like schoolgirls, and the king came and he knelt before families in Beit Shemesh. And I think Biden is having that kind of a moment now with the people of Israel, that in a way that I joke with some interviewer, if he would run for office, he would win in a landslide, because he identifies with the security of the people and with the release of the hostages. And I think when it comes to sending the aircraft carrier was a huge, important thing, because At that time, it looked like there could be a war with Lebanon, and that would have also come up against one of Biden's other objectives, which was to avoid regionalizing this war. We have a woman at the Washington Institute, Hanin Radar, who follows Lebanese public opinion. And she was noting on social media, there was all sorts of things on October 7th. We're joining the axis of resistance, we're joining. And then when Biden came and announced the aircraft carrier to make sure that Iron Dome could not be overwhelmed, suddenly she said the chatter sharply changed. It was, this is not our war. This is Hamas's war. They didn't consult with us. This doesn't obligate us. And Nasrallah, I believe, has given 5 speeches to the Lebanese people and his supporters. And so I think the timing sometimes is everything. And I think Biden's intervention was crucial. And, you know, it's the sense of identification with the people at a time of profound collective trauma, as Dalia outlined very well. So I think that's one objective. I think his second objective was, like I said, to avoid regionalizing this conflict. And that meant making sure that the Lebanon issue, yes, there's skirmishes. And by the way, it's devastating up in the north for Israel and also some of the southern towns of Lebanon. But it is not an all-out war. And I noticed when Israel killed Salah Haruri and Dahya in the heart of Beirut and made sure not one Hezbollah person was hurt. So I think there's an effort to try to keep this conflict within bounds. The U.S. would like a diplomatic resolution with maybe some sort of border demarcation. It's unclear to me if that's going to work, but it's part of the president's effort to try to think if there's a way to ensure that this does not spin out of control, because I think very clearly there's an understanding in the U.S. and in Israel, the lethality of Hezbollah is greater than Hamas. And this will take the war in very different directions. It is interesting that the supreme leader, Khamenei, is also very, in a calculating way, he said, look, you know, well, we here, at least, essentially, you know, we want Hezbollah as an insurance policy against an Israeli strike on our nuclear facilities. We didn't establish it to be, you know, get enmeshed in a war with the Sunni Hamas. So I think that's a second objective. The Houthi thing is turning out to be more challenging for the United States. The U.S. has said, we've got this, but it's a new Middle East. Some people have cruise missiles from Yemen, cruise missiles from Iraq, and they could try to hit Israel. Israel's old approach was we defend ourselves by ourselves. But in this new Middle East, I think it's clear that the U.S. military deployments have been important. It's important that they stop the Houthis. I think 30% of all container ships in the world go through the Suez Canal and the Red Sea. The chairman, I think, of the Suez Canal Authority yesterday, an Egyptian fellow, I believe, said that Suez Canal traffic is down by 40%. It's also critical in linking Europe and Asia. So that's a whole other piece. Maybe we'll get to that. The third objective, and, you know, judging from what Ahmed is saying, you know, the U.S. has not really done enough, but I think there's certainly an effort is to provide humanitarian assistance. I was glad to see that that Netanyahu basically announced the bringing in of 6 months of flour in the U.S., that he wasn't going to bring it, you know, it was clear he wasn't going to go through the cabinet, but it was just going to bring it in. And I think that's important. The trucks, you know, we could say, why isn't there more trucks? Over 200 now, but it's not where we were at the start of the war. So these are the 3 objectives I think the president's trying to balance analytically. How is he, you know, where is it going from here? I'm sure we'll discuss. It's clear, I think, for this administration, they won't, you know, and they're hearing it from Arab leaders. Like, these guys don't go on CNN, the Arab leaders, but with the exception of Jordan, I think many in the Gulf and Egypt would like to see Israel hit Hamas, but they would like to do it kind of cost-free. They don't want it. They don't want to see it on their television sets. They don't want to see innocent people hurt, of course. But I think it's not just getting it from Israel, the Congress, the American community, although I see 80% in this latest Harvard poll still support in the U.S. support Israel in its effort against Hamas, and even 69% think that Israel is trying to avoid civilian casualties. The U.S. has also taken a position in The Hague, so basically make it clear, along with the Germans and the French, this is no genocide. If Israel's trying to get 100,000, 1 million people on Salah ad-Din from North to South Gaza, then the idea is to avoid casualties. But as Ahmed said correctly, there's too many incidents in the South, even though, Israel, and I was just in Israel and met with senior officials for 2 weeks, it's clear that the South is a different kind of a war. And there's a lot of U.S.-Israel dialogue. Is there frustration, as you say, Senya? There is. And I think some of these moves, I think we're going to see something on the transfers of tax revenues to the Palestinian Authority. The Israeli security establishment, I think, is pleading with Netanyahu. And he knows it too, but he's fearful that, and Dalia, I'm sure we'll deal with this, but that Gantz and Eisenkot, the centrist, that has meant he's not dependent on the hard right. They'll leave soon, and once again, he is, and he doesn't want to run afoul of them. There are a lot of these incidents which has been points of tension with the United States, and I think, so they found an answer here using Norway in terms of the transfers that would have gone to Gaza, that Norway will hold an escrow. There are a bunch of these things. But still, I think for the administration, if I had to say one, the two big pictures are hostages. They want to get them out. There was, just before we had our Zoom now, there's a Washington Post story that Bill Burns, the head of the CIA, who was very key on when over 100 hostages got out in November. He was the pivot person for the United States. The news today that Burns is returning to the hostage negotiations, to me, is the best news that maybe there'll be a breakthrough here. So I think that is also for the administration. They understand this war might continue even after a pause, but the trajectory will not be what it is now. It won't be at the same intensity. We're already seeing 360 to 100,000 reservists, a drop of 260,000. And I think that trajectory is something the U.S. supports, that maybe it's going to look more like the West Bank. I don't know. Right now, the fighting is very intense. The other last thing I'll make, and I'm sorry, I don't want to talk too long, is just it's clear that for the United States, they want to come out of this with some big package with Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the Palestinians, if they can. The Saudis have kind of raised the terms during the war, and I would like some indication of a pathway to a statehood, not the state itself. And we know, and Dalia could give this better than I can, in terms of Israeli public opinion against this. But I think for the United States, a breakthrough with Saudi Arabia and Israel and the Palestinians would be, for the Biden people, would be a crowning achievement. It would have strategic value in marginalizing China in the Middle East, and it would have a lot of political value for this president during an election year. How and why, we could talk about this. I'm already feel I've talked too long, but I want to thank you for having me and to share this Zoom panel with such distinguished people.
Thank you very much, David. And actually, you brought me already to the first round of questions that I want to pose to each one of you. This question is about the role of the region. What kind of role the region can play in the future settlement and resolving the issue of not only Gaza, but in general, the Palestinian-Israeli struggle. And let me, David, immediately ask you the question about the timeline, because we are heading towards the American elections. November is just beyond the corner, although we are now just in January. So in this regards, do you think that the timeline of just short 10 months is enough in order to promote something as huge as the package that you mentioned with the Saudis, and also some kind of a settlement, or at least outline of a settlement within Israelis and Palestinians? And of course, we are talking here about the next day. I know that it's a huge question, but I will ask you to just do it in very briefly. You have 2 minutes.
Okay, look, I would just say on this, the U.S. is going to really try very hard on the Saudi breakthrough. It's interesting that Lindsey Graham, a staunch Republican, said only Biden could do this because a breakthrough which would involve a U.S.-Saudi defense treaty requires 2/3 of the U.S. Senate. There's not a lot of sympathy in the Democratic Party for Saudi Arabia, traditionally. But in deference to its leader, I do think that you would get many Democrats who would vote for it. Would that get to 67? We'll see. I think they would like to try it as soon as the spring. That might sound very ambitious. It's clear the hostage deal is the kind of off-ramp, not maybe to ending the war completely, but to changing the trajectory of the war. Maybe it's going to look more like Jenin, I don't know, in the West Bank or B areas or things like that. So I think they're definitely going to try. I can't predict success. The second point about an outlines of a state, I'm not sure they'll go that far, but I think the Saudis want something that they can say is big. And defining what Farhan, the foreign minister, said on Fareed Zakaria, I would urge people to watch that interview on Sunday. He said it's got to be a clear and irreversible step. Defining what that is, I think, is still to be defined. But it's clear that the Arab states want more than before October 7th. And it's clear that Israel, as Dalia outlined, is not really in a position, is so traumatized that I don't see that happening. The question is there a middle ground here between those two positions? I think the U.S. would like to try and go big. I think they see this, like I've said, this is like the Super Bowl, the World Cup, the World Series. If they could pull this off with the most influential Arab country, it would be the Abraham Accords on steroids. If it works, I personally think, and I saw Biden has said this publicly, that he believes Hamas did October the 7th because of the reports that the U.S. was working on Saudi Arabia, and it would be like game over for Hamas if there was such a breakthrough, and that this was done to try to stop that. And the U.S., I think, does not want to let Hamas deter them. I think they want to push forward.
Yeah. Thank you very much, David. And Ahmed, so the next question on the same issue to you. For Israelis, the participation of Saudi Arabia is it's a huge win. This is basically something that I would not say that for 100% of the Israelis, but for many, it's a reason to consider the possibility of reconciling with the Palestinians and accepting the two-state solution formula and so on. But it seems that, after we saw it after the Abraham Accords, their reaction to the Abraham Accords was negative. And also now, prior to 10/7, there were a lot of suspicions of the Saudis and how they are, gonna, throw the Palestinians under the bus. At least that was the perception. So do you think that the region is actually instrumental in shaping the day after in Gaza, or is it for Palestinians, is it counterproductive?
I actually have been saying that Saudi Arabia may very much hold the last hopeful card for the Palestinians to actually pressure the Israelis or the United States into doing anything. And I mean, I am personally, just with skin in the game, pinning a ton of hope on this. And absolutely, Hamas wanted, I mean, there are multiple, I don't believe it was just to prevent the Saudi-Israeli rapprochement that they launched this. I think Iran absolutely instigated, not planned this per se, but Netanyahu has been talking about an attack on Iran's nuclear program, and I strongly believe that Iran's interests were in delaying that by a few years and pushing it down the road. And then there's Hamas, in August, July and August, right around the time when those mass protests in Gaza were taking place. I had multiple sources in Gaza tell me that Qatar is getting tired of those $30 to $34 million worth of monthly payments to Hamas. And there are reports that, Netanyahu sent his Mossad chief to Qatar. People pushed back and forth on whether or not he actually did that out of his own volitions or not. But Qatar got tired of paying Hamas and wanted an off-ramp because they saw that nothing's happening in Gaza. So Hamas, in a way, launched this suicidal adventure to kind of run forward, as we have a saying in Arabic, run forward, to escape the Gaza quagmire. So going back to Saudi, I mean, the problem is that to convince the Saudis and to plant seeds, not just in the Saudi public opinion, but the Palestinian public opinion and the Arab public opinion, is going to have to be a heck of a lot more than just a pathway to statehood, a roadmap to statehood. On the other hand, the realist in me realizes that that's the only way it's going to start. You're not going to go overnight with a Palestinian state. So like, and I don't have the answer to that, but like the Arab public and the Palestinians and the leadership in Abbas and the Palestinian Authority, and not just Abbas, because Abbas is increasingly irrelevant. They're like Majid Faraj, the head of Palestinian intelligence, and like the few heads of security, even Mohammed Dahlan, who's the Gaza native, who's the Middle East power broker, and he's sponsored by the UAE. They want more than just, a pathway to statehood, but they also realize it's going to take time. So like, that's the challenge for me. But I absolutely believe that Saudi Arabia may be one of the last hopes for Palestinians to have anything meaningful resembling a state. I personally would even accept a roadmap to a state, because let's be honest, like, yes, it's going to take a lot of work. You're like, Gaza's in ruins. We're going to have to figure out administratively, like Hamas. That's what's so exceptionally nefarious about Hamas, is they entered a political process that was based upon recognizing Israel, the two-state solution, the renunciation of violence. And so can we salvage what remains of the Oslo framework without Hamas's rejectionist approach and political positions? That's going to take time. That's not going to happen overnight, and it's certainly not going to happen during a time of war.
Certainly not overnight. Yeah. Thank you very much, Ahmed. Our time is short, and we also want to make, to leave time for questions. We have many of those. But before that, Dalia. Ahmed just mentioned, that the very task of salvaging of what is left of the Oslo Accords, it will take enormous efforts. And frankly, you and I, we discussed it also in person, a lot of times, that not much is left, so it's something that was killed, especially, of course, by Hamas, and of course by the extremists on the Israeli side and so on. But for now, you still have the frame, but you don't have the substance, you don't have the trust. What needs to happen to regain, I don't know if it was there in the beginning, but to regain some form of trust there? Yeah.
Okay, first of all, I think I should point out that I'm not sure the ideal should be to return to the Oslo paradigm. I think part of the reason why we're in this situation today, I mean, I'm not trying to create blame. I know the people who wanted, who advanced Oslo and who conceived of Oslo really did have pretty noble intentions in mind of starting the first ever Israeli-Palestinian peace process leading towards somewhere. But there are very significant problems with that process, because it was never named the final status aim until much later on. It was phased and conditional in ways that seemed very constructive at the time, because there wasn't sufficient trust. But that was part of the downfall, because during all of that time, when the sides were waiting to find out what would happen next, each side was simply going in a different direction on some level. Again, I don't want to portray it as false symmetry. But the other thing is that Oslo was ultimately aimed at a traditional two-state separation, even though it never named that final status of a two-state solution. And I will say openly that I think the idea of a hard partition between a hard international border between two separate states is really no longer feasible and no longer desirable. Personally, I support two states in an open confederated arrangement that leaves a lot more potential for cooperation built into the institutions, greater mobility and greater economic opportunity and coordination on security, but as equals. So I think a lot of what we assumed was the aim of Oslo really needs to be redefined. We should not be trying to go back to a simple Oslo paradigm. In terms of what has to happen to rebuild trust, I honestly don't think that's the point. We can't imagine undertaking a process in order to rebuild trust so that we can eventually get to a solution. Trust will have to happen along the way. It will have to be a byproduct of the fact that there need to be leaders on both sides who are visionaries and who are able to confront their populations and say, the maximalist things that we've been advocating for a long time now. In Israel, we've had this leadership for about 15 years that has simply, quite openly, I should say, advocated complete permanent Israeli control over the entire region. And certainly in Gaza, they've been living under Hamas with its completely, a sort of theocratic and theologically driven vision of an Islamist maximalist society that's going to somehow, reclaim all of historic Palestine. And I think that there needs to be an overhaul of leadership. Honestly, it's a very dark time. I don't think anything will really change until the current leadership on both sides moves aside, because On the Israeli side, you can't expect the public to suddenly learn how to trust Palestinians right now. It's not going to happen. And on the other hand, you need the leadership to bring them there. But the current leadership is essentially fundamentally invested in a much more extremist, ultra-nationalist, maximalist, right-wing, hardline vision than any of the international players would like to believe. And Netanyahu himself is maybe much less of an ideologue, but he is very much hamstrung by those coalition partners on the further right, which we were already mentioned. And that's who he's going to be left with whenever this war cabinet breaks up. And so Israelis will have to make some very hard decisions about what comes next if they want to choose leaders who have some sort of vision. Part of the problem is that the current favorite to win elections, if they were held today, has not really demonstrated much of a vision. That's Benny Gantz. And that's because Israel has built an environment where the political leadership, any of them, including the opposition, are essentially afraid to say that they support something as big and visionary as the kinds of things we were talking about. I want to point out that on the Saudi issue, I know we do want to leave time for questions, but yeah, that would have been considered a major incentive. And Saudi Arabia does seem to be still open to this normalization. And they have, well, I can't say they, but there's a very interesting article in Al Majalla about exactly what the Saudi position should be. It's by an analyst, very good article, and outlining quite in detail. And one of the first items that they're saying is that the US should declare recognition of an independent Palestinian state within the Palestinian territories. These are creative ideas, but is the US going to fall into line? Would Israel even conceive of that under this leadership, of accepting something like that? Right now, the answer is absolutely no. So I'd like for trust to be reestablished at some point, but I think it will only come as a result of leadership-driven, top-down commitment to a fundamentally different mindset. It's not impossible, but the E5 will have to make these decisions and choose leaders that get to this point.
Thank you very much, Dalia. Leaders with vision, where we can get those? That's a rhetorical question. I would like to now to go to the questions of the audience. We'll start with Mark Zivin, who asks, I have heard that Israelis are not seeing the destruction and death and humanitarian issues that the war has created in Gaza. Do you think that if they were to be shown these consequences, that the attitude towards the war might change? And is there any way to pressure the media to show the Israeli public what is happening? I guess, Dalia, this is also to you. Please be very brief. I know that this is a wide topic to discuss, but nevertheless, please.
I'll just make a couple of very brief points. It's true that the Israeli media doesn't actually show the pictures of human suffering. There is certainly coverage of the widespread devastation of Gaza. There is no way to know in a counterfactual if that would somehow change everything. Even if the Israeli public was suddenly outraged about this, which by all survey research we have, they would not be. But even if they were, why would the government change its policy over that? The government hasn't changed its policy, or barely changed its policies in the face of massive social protests all year. Just barely changed its policies. So it's very hard to look at a counterfactual. My other point about that is that Israelis are a very wired society. We have 100% internet rate coverage in Israel, and there's no way, I think, to completely black out from the public mind just how vast the devastation is in Gaza. People may not be watching Al Jazeera Arabic every day, but they can't be completely unaware. And I think that it's a little bit too easy to have that be the reason why things aren't, why Israel isn't more supportive of ending the war and a ceasefire.
Okay.
May I quickly, Senia, just add something to that?
I'm turning to you, Ahmed, because I'm sure that you also have something to say about Al Jazeera Arabic. But there is also a question to you by Nadia about the day after in Gaza. Who should rule Gaza, if not Hamas, and how should this transition be made? So please, the floor is yours.
So I just released a piece with the Atlantic Council talking about some uncomfortable questions, and I just posted it on my timeline right before getting on. So like that addresses some day after scenarios in detail, and I encourage folks to check it out real quick. But just in the interest of time, because I do unfortunately have to leave shortly, I will say that, I mean, I have nurtured, and I get attacked for it all the time. I have a large following of pro-Israel folks and proud Zionists, and like I view that as like a great thing, because I want to reach audiences that are otherwise unreachable. And I will say to that earlier question that, like, when I share things that are critical of Hamas, like, of course, that gets positively received and shared, and people really are curious about anti-Hamas perspectives. When I share visual, well-documented, like in your face examples of suffering, not at the level of the Al Jazeera Arabic, which is nonstop, but like, you know, and I take the time to verify my sources, to verify the information. Usually there's like one of three responses. Either outright denial and like, this is fake, it must be Hamas shooting at them, it must be Hamas blowing them up, it must be whatever. Number two is, oh, well, you know, Hamas shouldn't have started this war, like tell them to release the hostages. I tell people all the time, there's no like 1-800 release the hostages Hamas number that I have, you know. So like, or number three, there are people that will actually slowly engage with this content and say privately to me in messages and WhatsApp and whatever, like, oh, I never fully realized that the extent of the suffering, like not as if that fundamentally changes their calculus, but there is absolutely like various degrees of, call it unwillingness to see the suffering, call it denialism, call it just hardening of the hearts. And by the way, that's also true, like don't get me started on some of the Palestinian stuff. I'm just specifically talking about the sad reality of how this is a disaster of epic proportion, the humanitarian suffering, the sheer death, the denial of the numbers. I don't deny that, yes, there might be some issues with the numbers, but this incessant, like 26,000, according to the Hamas-run authorities, as if that's like an immediate, you know, disclaimer that, like, you know. So anyway, I struggle with this because I wish people would register just how horrendously unprecedented this massive humanitarian disaster is happening at Israel's southern borders, and no amount of media blackouts, internet blackouts, blocking, you know, journalists, like that will reverberate for decades to come. So like, I wish there was more of a recognition.
Thank you very much, Ahmed, and we will totally understand if you'll need to leave, but if you also be able to stay for just one more question, we will greatly appreciate it. Okay, so just let me know. There is a question now for David Makovsky by Sarah Margoshes. The question is based on the David Makovsky and Dennis Ross's 2019 book, Be Strong and Good Courage, especially the chapter section, What America Can Do to Ease the Burdens of Choice for the Palestinians and Israelis. What are some of the US and other countries' commitments that could be made now to move the diplomatic needle to the future and the post-conflict Middle East?
Well, look, I just want to pick up really quickly on something Ahmed said, and something I think Dalia, in another interview we did together on NPR this morning. Look, there's a total lack of empathy here on either side. When the Israelis see the polls, believe me, they get a lot of attention that in the West Bank, 80% or whatever the number is, agree or happy about October 7th. They shut down. And I think, and so I don't here to excuse the lack of empathy at all, but in the middle of a war, it's very hard. And Dalia's right that everyone has an internet, everyone sees it. But even I watch Israeli television in Hebrew. I see, even, they might not show the innocents coming out of the rubble who have been killed, but they will show all these bombed out buildings all around the soldiers. I mean, it's not like you have these close shots and all you see is a soldier. You see the destruction. So they know it. And the lack of empathy is very hard to see on either side. So look, for the United States, like I said, where we go from here, I think the hope is some sort of mega deal, grand bargain, whatever term you want, because I think we do have to reframe. I wrote a book on decision making of Israel in Oslo in the 90s, and I think when the problem is just so stuck and it's going in the wrong direction, you have to somehow reframe the issue more broadly, that people see what they have to gain. And I think that is needed, and that's why I think if the Saudi thing works, I think it'd be great. I have more thoughts, but I think, I'm afraid to talk too long, and we're already over time.
So a question to Ahmed, and then there is a question to Dalia as well. Question for Mr. Al-Khatib. What is your stance on UNRWA? Do you agree that its actions add to the conflict instead of helping? What do people who are against the radicals in Gaza and in West Bank think about this mechanism of UNRWA?
I'll gladly answer this, and then I will unfortunately have to leave. So, I mean, multiple things can be true at once. I went to UNRWA schools. I ate from UNRWA food. My dad was a physician for UNRWA. Like, without UNRWA, the humanitarian suffering that Palestinians would have experienced, both not just in Gaza and the West Bank, but also in Syria and Jordan and Lebanon, would have been epically worse than it is today. Furthermore, in the territories, Israel would have had to shield a lot more responsibility for the well-being of people without UNRWA. So I think UNRWA, in a big picture, has absolutely saved and supported and improved a lot of lives with its provision of services, health, and food. That said, I am also critical of how, and I have talked to many Palestinians who think that, unfortunately, UNRWA has breeded kind of a culture of aid dependency. It has hindered a lot of progress and a lot of the space and creative opportunities for breaking out of being permanently reliant on UN aid. Furthermore, I'm critical of how UNRWA, there are numerous UN agencies that operate around the world, all with various talents and skills. But UNRWA, in a way, and I don't say this to like attack the good, wonderful people in UNRWA doing the work, but like a lot of Gazans call UNRWA the mafia, because they have a monopoly on a lot of UN operations. A lot of, like, part of the problems right now with the aid distribution problems is that UNRWA, because they said, well, we have the logistical network in Gaza, so we should be the only ones that do the aid distribution for the UN, when they should have brought in the UN refugee agency, and the World Food Program should have mobilized its vast assets. So, like, I think in other ways, UNRWA are unhelpful. As for how penetrated, by Hamas, so it is absolutely a case, that case that Hamas has members and has affiliates and has people that are employees of UNRWA. Does that mean UNRWA itself is a Hamas organization? No, like those are just simplistic reductionist views. Does UNRWA have an unenviable task of operating in a Hamas-dominated area? Absolutely, that is very true. So like multiple things are true. UNRWA is important. UNRWA is necessary. Long term, I think we need to move away from UNRWA, but I don't think doing that now under combat conditions or during one of the worst disasters the Palestinians have ever experienced is the move. And I think there are legitimate critiques of UNRWA being penetrated by Hamas, being ineffective, being, kind of like monopolizing and controlling the affairs, the humanitarian affairs and all the UN affairs in Gaza. I think that's very detrimental. So it's important. And like I said, I literally went to UNRWA schools. We had a lot of lice. They were not pleasant schools. We had 60 students per class, but that is how I got my education. And that is actually the seeds for how I became good at speaking English, was at UNRWA schools. And I had excellent English teachers. So I'm grateful for that.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. And again, let me thank you on behalf of Ropes for doing this, for your strong and independent voice. And again, I encourage all of our attendees, follow these guys on Twitter, follow Ahmed, follow David, follow Dalia. Thank you very much, Ahmed. And Dalia, I still have one question that I promised to you. We will not be able to take all of them, but there is one that is very important. It's fundamentally important because it's a question about how going back to 67 borders, in case that there is some kind of settlement, with the provisions, with some land swaps and so on, can provide security and end wars, not only this war, but for the future.
Thank you. I will have to go after this as well.
Yeah.
We're
finishing after this.
I get if was implying that the choice is between going back to something close to the 67 borders or Israel retaining full control over the entire area, including the West Bank and Gaza. I think that the main thing to keep in mind is that all of Israel's attempts to control the Palestinians militarily, to deny their self-determination and deny their statehood, have led us to ongoing cycles of war and conflict, which have never really ceased, to be honest, starting with, essentially first Intifada and then the phase of Oslo, which sort of, had its own problems. But ever since the peace process has died completely, which was somewhere between, the end of the Camp David negotiation process and in the early 2000s and the second Intifada, and between, let's say 2013-14, when there were last serious negotiations. But since that peace process has completely died, the violence has just gotten worse. What we saw on October 7th is in no way, nobody should ever misinterpret me as justifying such horrors, but it was part of an ongoing cycle of violence that has never been peaceful. And frankly, it was not peaceful for Israelis either, especially those who lived in the south under rocket fire. And so if the alternative is for Israel to continue in that mindset, that it can not resolve the conflict, that it can continue to deny a situation, deny Palestinian self-determination, I think that that is the choice that leads towards future cycles of complete lack of security. Now, can I say that it will be perfectly secure, that there will never be anybody who's harmed as a result of the conflict if there is a political resolution that is based on Palestinian self-determination within the 67 areas? Of course not. I don't know any place in the world where there is such a thing as perfect security. However, I do think that if you have, first of all, a political horizon for Palestinians, as we always see, Palestinians become more supportive of a peace process and less supportive of violence. And if you have the two sides, well, certainly if you have the Palestinian side that feels that its need for self-determination and its need for security also is being treated as an equal priority to Israeli self-determination and Israeli security, then you have the basis for a better partnership. I don't see how you can possibly manage security effectively in a two-state situation or any other situation without the partnership of both sides. And how do I know that? Because Israel and the Palestinian Authority have been cooperating on security in a very, very charged and unequal situation of ongoing occupation. But it's been continuing for all these years since Oslo. And we did not see October 7th coming from the West Bank. Not that things are good in the West Bank. It could spread there any day. But the point is that that kind of cooperation is possible. It is probably the only way to achieve better security in the future. And it cannot continue to happen under a situation of Israeli permanent control over Palestinians. So that would be my argument for the only possible way to go back to something like the 67 borders is under a situation of Palestinian self-determination, a political horizon, hopefully one that incorporates and is fundamentally grounded in institutional cooperation between the two sides.
Thank you very much, Dalia. Again, thanks a lot to all of our panelists, David Makovsky, Dalia Scheindlin, and Ahmad Fouad Al-Khatib for your perspective. I think that we actually did a lot in just 1 hour. We did discuss the next phase of the war and the requirements for any kind of settlement, the involvement of the region, the American policy. But there are obviously many more issues that needs to be discussed and put out there. So we will continue with the series of ROPES webinars. So please follow our advertisements on our websites, ropes.org, and also on social media. I also invite you to tune into our weekly podcast, the Ropes Cast, that I'm hosting together with Ibrahim Abu Ahmad. We invite interesting people from Israel, Palestinian Autonomy, Arab countries, the United States, and it's never dull. Again, thank you so very much for tuning in. ROPES is continuing its work also in these very difficult circumstances. In 2023, we nearly doubled our fundraising. We are getting prepared for our upcoming program that will take place later in spring. And there will be also many more. Hopefully, there will be an opportunity also for do more regional cooperation projects that will be also covered by the media, and we will, of course, will publish all of that. Let me just share with you a QR code. If you want to help ropes, if you want to donate, you are able to do this via the QR code that we are posting here, also via our website, ropes.org. Again, this event would not be able to take place without the support of our donors, of our many supporters, of our network, and we are very grateful for them, for their continuous support. We believe in ropes that the only way to increase the peace, it's not only the security arrangements, but it's the dialogue and it's integration, economic integration, humanitarian, social, cultural, diplomatic, and so on. And we will make all of our efforts to make it happen. So thank you all very much. Thanks for all of our attendees. Thanks to all of our panelists, and shalom and salam from Jerusalem.